Nation says locust swarms are threatening the food supply of millions. They've devastated thousands of crops as they move across parts of Africa.
For years, East Africa battled an enemy that moved like smoke across the sky. Billions of locusts devouring everything in sight.
The desert locust is a very widespread species that occurs in the Sahel, in parts of the Horn of Africa, in the Middle East, all the way into Asia.
Entire harvests vanished, and the land turned silent beneath their wings. The world sent help, and it failed.
We know that these locusts, the locusts that we see here, can create really massive devastation, not only in terms of crop, but also in terms of pasture, and therefore affecting the livelihoods of the pastoralist communities.
Sprays, drones, and fire couldn't stop them. But then, Africa did something no one believed was real. In a move that defied logic and every scientific prediction, billions of locusts were released on purpose. What followed turned a crisis into something no one saw coming. Africa's food crisis. It is hard to imagine that a continent known for its vast, fertile lands and flowing rivers now struggles just to feed its people. Yet that is the reality of Africa today. Right now, Africa shelters 1.5 billion people. In 25 years, that number is expected to climb to 2.5 billion. Still, 307 million Africans go to bed hungry on a regular basis. That's roughly 1 in every 5 people unable to find enough food to survive. By 2030, forecasts place 582 million people worldwide in a state of chronic undernourishment, and more than half of them will be in Africa. More than 45 million children under age 5 suffer from wasting, which is the most life-threatening form of malnutrition. Nearly 2/3 of those children live in sub-Saharan Africa. The numbers are not abstract. They are measured in empty bowls, in the quiet of clinics where mothers hold fevered babies, and in the blank faces of children who should be playing. In Sudan, the situation has tipped toward catastrophe. More than 8 million people are teetering on the edge of survival, and 638,000 face days with nothing to eat. South of there, in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia, the pattern repeats. It is hard to reconcile this with older images of East African richness, which includes basalt plains that once made soil thick and black. A Nile so deep and blue it seemed endless, and the broad sweep of Lake Victoria feeding villages for generations. So, what went wrong? Conflict answers part of the question. War scatter planting schedules and force families from their fields. Infrastructure failures worsen the problem. Around a quarter of all crops spoil because there is no cold storage and roads are unreliable. Billions of dollars each year is spent on importing food that could be grown closer to home. Even when families have enough money to buy food, the weather often decides otherwise. Droughts scorch the earth, and this leaves crops withered and livestock dead. Then the rains return. Not gently, but in floods that wash away what little remains. The cycle repeats itself, with each wave pushing millions closer to starvation. And just when it seemed that things could not possibly get worse, something completely unexpected entered the picture. Something that would change the fight against hunger in ways no one saw coming. The swarm that came with the wind. Late in 2019, something small but devastating began to stir over Africa's skies. It started with hot wind rising from the Arabian desert and heavy rains soaking the Indian Ocean basin. This created the perfect breeding ground for one of the most feared insects on Earth, the desert locust. Normally, these insects live quiet, solitary lives scattered across dry landscapes. But nature had something different in mind. When long dry periods suddenly give way to heavy rains, it causes the land to transform. Moist soil awakens new vegetation, and that fresh greenery calls out to locusts like a feast waiting to be consumed. The damp earth becomes the perfect place for them to lay their eggs. It ensures their offspring survive the harsh sun. At first, they are few, but then the real change begins. As more locusts gather in one place, they start touching and bumping into each other. They also react to each other's scent. This constant stimulation triggers something extraordinary. Their bodies grow larger. Their color shifts to bold black and yellow, and their behavior changes completely. The once quiet, green, night-loving insects become aggressive and restless. More importantly, they become social. Scientists call this process gregarization. Now, instead of avoiding one another, they crave company. They form clusters which result in gigantic swarms, moving together like one unstoppable living cloud. These new super locusts develop stronger wings, larger muscles, and sharper coordination. They can travel long distances as they fly up to 90 miles in a single day. And when they arrive, they don't just eat, they destroy. A single swarm can hold around 80 million locusts, consuming as much food in one day as 35,000 people. Crops vanish overnight. Trees are stripped bare. In the silence that follows, nothing green remains. East Africa soon became the center of this unfolding nightmare. Countries like Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, and Uganda found themselves trapped beneath skies which was darkened by insects. In Kenya alone, 70,000 hectares of farmland were overrun. Across the region, over 20 million people were pushed into severe food insecurity. Entire harvests disappeared before they could even be collected. The cruel part was how foreseeable the whole situation had been. Months earlier, the Food and Agriculture Organization had issued a warning about the locusts. However, many nations lacked the necessary tools to act. As a result, communities that had barely recovered from drought now faced starvation again. By the time the world realized how serious it had become, it was already too late. Governments and aid agencies rushed to act, but the damage had already spread far and wide, and as the skies over East Africa swarmed with life, scientists began searching for a solution unlike any before. Something unexpected was about to be tried. Nature's failed cure. They called it the green weapon, a solution which was born out of desperation and hope. For years, chemical pesticides had been the only defense against the desert locust. They worked, yes, but at a price. Fields were drenched in toxins which did not discriminate as they killed not only the pests, but also the creatures that kept the ecosystem balanced. Over time, the soil suffered. Water sources were poisoned. And farmers began to question if their fight for food security was slowly destroying the land itself. That was when science tried to take a gentler path. Researchers turned to nature for answers and found something extraordinary. What they discovered was a fungus known as Metarhizium acridum. Unlike the harsh chemicals, this fungus killed only locusts, and it left everything else unharmed. It was seen as a breakthrough and a nature-based biopesticide that promised to change how Africa battled its most destructive pest. The Food and Agriculture Organization, working alongside the British government, brought the fungus into East Africa. They believed it would be the weapon that finally turned the tide. The idea sounded simple enough. When a locust comes in contact with the fungal spores, it gets infected. The fungus then burrows through the insect's tough outer shell and begins to grow inside. It spreads through its body until it consumes it from within. In a few days, the locust would die, releasing more spores into the air, which is ready to infect the next swarm. On paper, it seemed flawless. A single droplet of the spore solution could travel for miles. It would be carried by the wind and multiply with every contact. It was supposed to be the biological miracle the region had been waiting for. But Africa's deserts had other plans. The fungus was fragile. To stay alive, it needed to be stored below 40 degrees Fahrenheit. That might sound simple in a lab, but in the searing heat of Kenya, Ethiopia, and Somalia, it became nearly impossible. Many rural areas had no stable power supply, and almost 70% of storage sites lacked refrigeration entirely. In reality, these facilities were little more than tin shacks baking under the desert sun. By the time the spores were needed most, they were already dead. Over 300,000 liters of the precious fungus solution lost viability before it could even be sprayed. The FAO had estimated that, if used properly, the fungus could have reduced the locust population by 90% in just a few days. But that never happened. Instead, the surviving swarms kept breeding. Billions of locusts multiplied and spread across new regions. Crops vanished once again, and farmers could do nothing but watch as their labor was destroyed. It was a devastating lesson. Science had offered a lifeline, but nature once again proved harder to control. What happened next would force the world to rethink how it fights nature's oldest plagues. Green gold of the desert. Nobody saw it coming. That the same insects destroying Africa's crops could also become the key to survival. When the swarms first arrived, they stripped the land bare and left nothing but dust and despair. But hunger does strange things to the human mind. Soon, a daring idea began to spread through the villages. If they could not stop the locusts, maybe they could turn them into food. At first, it sounded desperate. Eating the very creatures that had ruined their harvests felt like defeat. But when weeks turned into months with little to eat, people began to act. Families gathered what they could, collecting locusts from fields, catching them at night when they clung to trees or trapping them in nets near the rivers. Once collected, they dried them under the hot sun, ground them into a fine powder and mixed it with grain flour. It wasn't gourmet cooking, but it kept people alive. From porridge to bread, these meals gave strength to those who had lost almost everything. Across Kenya, Uganda, and Ethiopia, something unexpected began to happen. Villages that once saw the sky darken with fear now saw opportunity. Locusts were no longer just pests. They were becoming a lifeline. People began calling them the green gold of the desert. The same insects that once symbolized hunger were now helping to fight it. Elders who had lived through countless invasions began to speak differently. Some said that when the swarms come, they no longer curse but prepare their cooking fires. They claimed a single swarm could feed a community for weeks. Then came a revelation that shocked even scientists. When researchers analyzed the locusts, they discovered something remarkable. These insects were packed with nutrients, and not just a little. Every 3.5 ounces of dried locusts held between 1.5 to more than 2.5 ounces of pure protein. To put that in perspective, the same amount of chicken has only about 1.2 ounces, and beef has about 1. In other words, pound for pound, locusts contain more than twice the protein of beef. But that wasn't all. Locusts are loaded with iron, zinc, calcium, and omega-3 fatty acids. These are nutrients that millions across East Africa don't get enough of. The Food and Agriculture Organization even confirmed that producing a pound of locust meat uses only 1/10 the land and water needed for beef. That meant the solution to both hunger and sustainability might have been buzzing right in front of them all along. But as people found hope in this unlikely food source, a new question started to rise among scientists and leaders. If the locusts were this valuable, could they actually become part of Africa's future food system? Or would the next swarm bring back the same fear that once left millions starving? Something was changing across the continent, and for the first time in a long while, the future didn't look entirely hopeless. The new cash crop. When the locusts came, most people saw only destruction, but a few saw something different. They saw a strange kind of opportunity hidden inside the chaos. In the middle of the crisis, a small startup began to change how people saw the insects that had haunted their lives for generations. That startup was called The Bug Picture and was founded in Kenya with one bold idea, which was to turn the swarms into a resource instead of a threat. Instead of treating locusts like pests, they treated them like a moving harvest. The company focused on using the insects to create organic fertilizer and protein-rich animal feed, and by so doing tackled both hunger and environmental damage at the same time. It was an idea that seemed impossible until it worked. With the help of emergency funding from Danida, the Bug Picture began mobilizing local communities in areas hit hardest by the invasion. This included places like Laikipia, Isiolo, and Samburu. They taught people how to collect the locusts safely and efficiently. What had once been sleepless evenings filled with fear now became productive hunts under the stars. Locusts are cold-blooded creatures. As soon as the sun goes down and the temperature falls below 68 degrees Fahrenheit, their bodies slow down, and they become nearly motionless. That is when the hunters move in. If you walk through those villages at night, you would see hundreds of people with sacks, plastic buckets, and flashlights scattered across the fields collecting the insects. The bug picture pays each collector 50 Kenyan shillings per kilogram, which is roughly 35 cents. It does not sound like much, but a skilled hunter can earn between $30 to $50 in a single night. This is about the same amount a farmer would make in a whole month. In a time when crops were gone and families struggled to survive, this unexpected source of income became a lifeline. Between the 1st and 18th of February 2021, the project recorded over 1.3 tons of locusts harvested. Once the sacks are full, workers load them into barrels and crush the insects before sending them to the company's factory in Nairobi. There, the locusts are washed, sanitized, dried, and ground into fine protein powder. A ton of fresh locusts is valued at about $460, but after processing, the value multiplies 5 to 7 times. That means the same pests that once ruined farmlands are now creating sustainable profit. Laura Stanford, the founder of The Bug Picture, said their goal was to create hope where there was none, and also to help people see the insects not as a plague, but as a seasonal crop that can be harvested and sold for income. Her vision was to reshape how people interact with nature to make sustainability something that begins at the community level. This model of community-based harvesting is now seen as an innovative way to deal with small locust swarms that can't be reached by the large-scale pesticide operations carried out by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. It's particularly useful when swarms are too close to human settlements for spraying to be safe. Insect fertilizer. For years, the same insects that once stripped entire fields bare have now become the very thing breathing life back into them. When the locusts were harvested and processed into protein, what remained, such as shells, wings, and dried fragments, could have been discarded. But the Bug Picture saw something far more valuable hiding in those remains. They discovered that these insect leftovers held the power to heal the land itself. Rather than letting them rot away, the company turned the remains into organic fertilizer. From the dust of destruction, a new kind of soil booster was born. According to the Bug Picture, a single ton of processed locusts can produce nearly 900 pounds of this fertilizer. That's enough to rejuvenate close to 2 acres of barren soil. But the impact went far beyond just improving crop yields. Scientists studying the new fertilizer found that it encouraged the growth of beneficial microorganisms in the soil. These microbes, which are responsible for nutrient cycling, help plants absorb more of what they need while reducing the dependence on chemicals. The result was a richer earth, stronger roots, and a more sustainable farming system which works in harmony with nature rather than against it. In arid parts of Kenya, farmers began experimenting with what they called insect fertilizer. They poured it over their cracked fields, half out of hope and half out of desperation. What followed was almost unbelievable. The once dry soil started holding moisture again, and blades of grass began pushing through the dust. Within a single growing season, yields increased drastically. One farmer shared that he used to spend over $100 on a single bag of chemical fertilizer imported from Nairobi. But now, with this new organic alternative, he did not have to depend on that anymore. He simply uses what nature provides for free. No more chemical residues, no more costly imports. Just a cycle of growth where nothing goes to waste. Environmental specialists have started calling this change the green cycle of Africa. It's a fitting name for a movement where everything is repurposed. The locusts that once brought despair are now part of a sustainable loop that are restoring life to the very farms they once destroyed. From destruction came renewal, but something even more remarkable was still on the horizon. The bug that saved the cattle. In many parts of East Africa, hunger isn't limited to people alone. The animals were starving too. Without grass or water, herds moved endlessly under a blazing sun as they searched for anything green. But as droughts grew longer and rain fell less often, the land gave up. What was once pasture had turned into cracked earth. By the year 2022, Kenya faced what experts called the worst drought in 4 decades. The impact was brutal. Over 2.5 million livestock died, and it left entire communities without their only source of income and food. Families could only watch helplessly as cows, goats, and sheep collapsed one after another. The loss ran into millions of dollars, but the emotional weight went far deeper. For pastoral families, this was more than loss. It was the collapse of a way of life passed down through generations. Then, from the most unexpected source, help arrived. Scientists began experimenting with the locusts that had been previously seen as a plague. When ground into a fine powder, the level of nutrition in them was remarkable. Laboratories in Kenya and Ethiopia began mixing locust powder into livestock feed, and what started as a small trial soon became a breakthrough. Research conducted by the International Center of Insect Physiology and Ecology, in conjunction with the Food and Agriculture Organization, showed astonishing results. Cows that ate feed containing insect powder produced 15 to 25% more milk. Chickens laid 20% more eggs. Even more striking was what happened with goats. Kid mortality dropped by almost 40%. These weren't random improvements. Farmers could see the difference with their own eyes. Animals grew healthier, stronger, and more resilient against disease and heat. Another study by the FAO revealed something even more surprising. Every single ton of insect powder could replace 1.5 tons of fish meal. That meant less dependence on expensive imports and more savings for the local economy. Considering how much Africa spends each year importing fish meal for animal feed, this discovery could save millions of dollars annually. In this new cycle, everything connected. Locusts that once destroyed crops were now feeding livestock. Livestock, in turn, nourished families and strengthened communities. It became a closed loop where nothing was wasted, and survival turned into sustainability. The same insects that had once symbolized disaster had become the foundation of renewal. And yet, as farmers celebrated, few realized that this was only the first chapter of a much bigger transformation. Inside Africa's locust farms. The world had finally stopped shaking under the thunder of locust wings, but the silence that followed brought its own troubles. The insects had almost vanished. They were not gone forever, but their numbers had fallen sharply after years of being harvested by humans. Croplands began to heal. Golden fields of millet, wheat, and corn stretched again under the sun, a sight that brought relief to many who had nearly lost everything. But with that relief came an unexpected problem. The locusts that had once been turned into animal feed were suddenly gone, and so was a cheap source of protein for poultry and fish farmers. In both Kenya and Uganda, prices of soy and fish meal rose by more than 40%. The shortage of quality feed began hurting production, and farmers struggled to keep up with rising demand. The same insects which were once cursed for destroying food had become essential for keeping livestock alive. It was a strange twist no one could have predicted. Faced with this new reality, scientists and agricultural experts began asking an unusual question. What if humans could farm the locusts themselves? Not chase them across deserts, but raise them in a controlled setting, safely, efficiently, and sustainably. From that idea came one of the boldest agricultural experiments in the region's history. In the year 2022, researchers from Makerere University in Uganda and Egerton University in Kenya introduced a field-scale prototype designed to breed desert locusts at an industrial level. The experiment took shape in Homa Bay County, Kenya, where vast domed structures stood like bubbles of innovation against the dry landscape. The design, known as Roof Park Greenhouse Technology, or RPGT, created the perfect artificial environment for locust growth. Inside the domes, temperature and humidity were carefully controlled. In addition, gauze cages were used to prevent any chance of escape. Thousands of insects could thrive in these contained systems, without posing a threat to surrounding farms. Their diet was simple but strategic. Traditionally, locusts fed on crops like wheat and beans, but scientists began experimenting with non-food plant options in order to ensure sustainability. If they succeeded, it would mean large-scale locust farming could feed both people and animals without competing with human food supplies. However, not everyone shared the optimism. Experts from the Food and Agriculture Organization expressed serious concern. They warned that a single gap in the containment system, such as a broken panel or an unsealed vent, could lead to catastrophe. Even 500 female locusts escaping into the wild could reproduce fast enough to form a swarm covering 40 square miles in just 6 weeks. That kind of outbreak would no longer be a natural disaster. It would be a man-made one. And the question remained, how long could humanity play with nature before nature decided to strike back? From African fields to global markets. It started as a survival move in Africa, but soon, the world began to take notice. From the dusty plains of East Africa, the idea of using insects as food and feed spread far beyond the continent's borders. What many once called a desperate experiment was now becoming a global movement. Within just a few years, what began as a solution to hunger in Kenya, Uganda, and Ethiopia was reshaping the way the world thought about food. Europe was among the first to follow. The European Union officially approved migratory locusts as a novel food, and as a result allowed them to be sold in frozen, dried, and powdered forms. In countries like the Netherlands and Switzerland, supermarket chains introduced insect-based burgers to their shelves. These burgers were not just trendy. They contained up to 40% protein, which is nearly double what you would find in a regular beef burger. It was proof that the world's perception of food was shifting fast. People began to realize that insect protein wasn't just more affordable. It was also one of the most sustainable sources of nutrition on the planet. Studies showed that it was 12 times more eco-friendly than red meat, consuming far less land and water while releasing only a fraction of the carbon emissions. The numbers spoke for themselves. Meanwhile, in Singapore, the insect feed technologies facility in Tuas was taking the concept even further. Inside the massive plant, more than 2 billion black soldier fly larvae worked around the clock, breaking down roughly 110 tons of food waste every single day. The process didn't just recycle waste. It also reduced 8,000 tons of carbon dioxide emissions each year. What had started as an idea born from hunger was now helping solve one of humanity's biggest environmental problems. Across the globe, innovation was accelerating. Technologies which had once existed only inside small research labs were now part of a booming $3 billion industry. Analysts projected that number would triple by the year 2030. New startups were emerging everywhere, all racing to perfect the art of insect farming. They were developing automated breeding systems, nutrient analysis tools, and large-scale feed processing machines. All of these were designed to turn insects into a steady source of protein for both animals and humans. Yet, amid all the excitement, many forgot where it all began. Few realized that the foundation of this billion-dollar industry had been laid in Africa, where the world once watched helplessly as swarms of locusts devoured everything in sight. But now, those same lands have become centers of innovation. In Kenya, Ethiopia, and Somalia, small farmers who had suffered the most were now leading a quiet revolution. They had learned to transform the very thing that caused destruction into a source of strength. Their work not only fed communities, it also inspired an entirely new approach to sustainability. When people imagine the future of food, they often think of advanced robotics, artificial intelligence, and high-tech factories. But perhaps the real future lies in the hands of those African farmers who first saw value in what the world ignored: a tiny insect that could change everything. If this video opened your eyes to how nature can rebuild itself in the most unexpected ways, make sure to leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.